Hey everyone, this is Grandmaster Finegold with our lecture of the week. This lecture is brought to you by Patrick Davenport, our wonderful sponsor. And he's offered to sponsor many, many more lectures at double the price, plus tax with no tax. Today's lecture regards games between Bobby Fischer and Mikhail Tal. And I'm going to tell a lot of stories about them, and if you don't believe them, they'll definitely be tall tales. Now, Tal and Fischer had an unusual balance of winning and losing, mainly because Tal is 8.5, let's see, is that right? 36, 43, 6.5 years older than Fischer. So when they first played, Tal was like world champion or close to world champion, and Fischer was 15, 16 years old. So advantage Tal. Then as Fischer got into his 20s, then he was probably better than Tal. So, then he started winning. All of their games are wild and crazy, even their draws. And since the lecture is 45 minutes to an hour, I got to do what I can do. Two of the games I've seen many times. One game I've never seen before is actually a blitz game. And I'm only showing the end of it because the end is very funny. Unless you're Tal, then it's not funny. So the last two games I could find them playing against each other were in a blitz tournament, which Fischer won, I believe in 1971. It could have been 70. And then, the truth hurts after that. They're both very combative players, and neither one wants to draw, and they both play for a win with white and black. They're both world champions. So that's good. And according to legend, and you know that it's true because it's according to legend, as you all know, Tal was very sick his whole life, and he often went to the hospital during tournaments and between tournaments. And in one of the episodes where he went to the hospital, the claim was the only player from the tournament to visit Tal in the hospital was Fischer. Because as we all know, he was such a nice guy. Okay, so let's start in 1959, because you got to start somewhere. In 1959, that was the year that Fischer turned 16. So wasn't his absolute best, but pretty good. Fischer has the white pieces, I hope. Okay, and he played E4 like he likes to do, and Tal played the Sicilian. Tal usually plays the Sicilian, but not always. And they got what's called the Najdorf Sicilian, which Fischer also occasionally played with black, especially when his opponent played E4. So, okay, people are still coming into the lecture. They're fashionably late, so they must be the highest rated players. All right, and Fischer and Tal played the old main line, which isn't so popular now. They play it occasionally. Oh, no, I'm sorry, he played bishop c4. That's another game I was looking at, was the old main line with bishop g5. And a lot of players nowadays will play some combination of bishop e3 and f3, the so-called English attack. And bishop c4 was called the Sozin variation, and then Fischer played it so often, it was called the Fischer-Sozin. And a lot of times in the Velimirovich attack, or the Sozin, or the Fischer-Sozin, or any Sicilian where white plays bishop c4, white has the option of castling kingside or queenside. And when I have the black pieces in Sicilians, my opponents almost always castle queenside, which is the style now. And Fischer, in this variation, almost always castle kingside. So the Fischer-Sozin. Okay, e6, and he played bishop to b3. There's copious notes to this game, most of which I will ignore because I don't have a 7-hour lecture lined up here. But it sounds fun, a 7-hour lecture. Okay, the bishop's better on b3 for several reasons. One of them is it isn't hanging on b3. It's defended 3.5 times. And black is often playing b5, which gains a tempo on the bishop. So the bishop's going to go to b3 anyway. The reason Fischer played bishop c4 to b3 was he wanted to hammer the center with f4, f5, and pressure e6. Okay, and Tal played b5, and Fischer decided not to defend his e-pawn, and he let Tal capture it. He played f4, and Tal's like, all right, I'll capture the pawn. b4 attacking the knight moves away, and he takes the pawn on e4. So this is very dangerous to take the pawn because black's development isn't very good. But black wins the center pawn, so grandmasters like winning center pawns. And as we like to say here at the Chess Center, you got to risk it to get the biscuit. So it's very risky, and both these players were geniuses at calculating. So, okay, and Fischer castled. And right away, Tal made an error in this position. He should play bishop b7, defending his knight and developing his bishop, but Tal wasn't developing his pieces very much this game, and he decided instead to stop the play that I mentioned earlier with f5. And what Tal didn't realize was trying is the first step to failure. So he played g6, which stops f5, except for one thing. Fischer played, this is where you unmute and say the answer.
f5?
F5, yeah. So if you play g6 to stop f5, and f5 is a good move, probably you shouldn't have played g6. Okay, so e takes f5 doesn't make a lot of sense because you're opening up this diagonal for the bishop. You're opening up d5 for the bishop. So he took with the g-pawn, which makes more sense. And I guess Fischer knew that 60 years later, I would be streaming and I would suggest knife f5. So Fischer played knife f5. And as you can see, black's king isn't the safest. And if you take the knight, you're giving away the d5 square. So these pieces are lined up to get forked by a queen or by a bishop, which is probably why the annotator of the game thought black should play bishop b7 earlier to defend that diagonal, develop a piece, defend his knight, etc. Okay, so Tal decided not to take it and just played rook to g8, putting his rook on the open g file. And again, if you make surprising moves and they're good, normally that throws your opponent off and they don't play very well. And this is something that Tal usually did to his opponents. So that's why the Fischer-Tal games were such great games, because in this game, Fischer made more surprising moves than Tal did, but Tal was such a great player, he wasn't thrown off like most of us would be. Obviously, when Tal played g6, he wasn't expecting f5 or knight f5, or the move that Fischer played in this position, bishop d5. Normally, you think you're stopping those moves when you have pawns that can capture. But, again, these pieces are lined up on the same diagonal. So if you take the bishop and the queen takes, you're forking the rook and the knight. Sometimes queen takes f7 is mate when the knight on f5 moves. So you got to watch it. And Tal played a surprising move, although only surprising to me, probably not surprising to Fischer. Played rook a7. And the idea is, after bishop takes knight, we can take the knight on f5, and the e file is open to the king, but we can block it with the rook or the bishop. And this is a very strange material imbalance. Right now, black is up exactly one pawn. Black is threatening the bishop on e4, but black's position looks completely ridiculous. So you would expect white has an excellent position here, and you would be correct. And Fischer took the pawn, materials equal, white has the better pawn structure, white has the safer king. A really good outcome for the opening for white. It's a Sicilian, and black's king's never going to get safe. Tal played rook e7, trying to make the best of a bad situation. Fischer traded bishops. And in this position, Fischer made quite a bad move, which threw away most of his advantage. So I was complaining about black's position a lot. His king's in the center, his pawn structure's terrible, white's position looks perfectly reasonable. However, there is one bad thing about white's position. It's the knight on a4. If that knight was on a normal square, somewhere where you would normally have a knight, probably white would just be winning. But the knight on a4 is terrible. And because the knight on a4 is terrible, black is threatening queen c6, attacking the knight and threatening mate. So white should have defended one and then the other. But Futurama wasn't out yet because it was 1959. The annotator suggests c3, so the queen defends the knight, and then if you threaten mate on g2, just rook f2. And white has a big advantage because eventually that knight's going to be okay, and black's king is never going to be okay. But Fischer ignored all of that. He played bishop f4, and after queen c6, he sacrificed a piece, although I guess he has to sacrifice a piece because he has to stop mate. And he did stop mate, and if Tal trades queens, white just has an endgame advantage because black's pawn structure is so bad. And Tal's like, all right, I'll be a knight up. I'm up a knight. And white has really good compensation, but black's up a knight. So I'm not sure why Fischer played bishop f4, queen f3. I'm guessing he thought that this was good for white. It was a good piece sacrifice. Okay, bishop takes d6, and he played queen c6, defending. If he can trade queens and lose the exchange, he'll have two pieces for a rook, and I can't see black losing that position. So Fischer took on b8, and now if you trade queens, then white's just up a pawn. So Tal decided to stay a piece ahead. He checked and took the bishop. So black is up a piece, but again, black's position looks pretty strange. King's on e8 and rook's on e7. Pawns aren't good. White's king is safe, but he's up a bishop. So, okay, queen c6 check, rook to d7, and rook a e1 check. They give lots of variations, but okay, rook a e1 check looks perfectly reasonable. And the first time I saw this game, I think was my 60 memorable games, and I just want to show one variation. If king d8, white plays rook takes f7, and you can't take the rook because rook e8 is mate. That's a pretty cool variation. So probably black shouldn't do that. Okay, so bishop e7. And I think Fischer claimed he was fine here. I think he is. Although I like being a piece up. So, and Fischer played rook takes f7, winning another pawn. But unfortunately, his attack is going away. And the person who annotated this game, I think, thinks this position is a draw, even though black is up a piece, because black's king is so terrible. Black's king is terrible, I agree. But obviously I'm taking black here. Black's up a bishop. Okay, and again, you want to trade all the pawns off if you're white, because if there's no pawns on the board, black's not going to win rook and bishop versus rook, unless, white blunders or something. So, okay, and in this position, according to the annotator, queen e4 should draw the game, putting the queen in the center, and this is the line that he gives. You can't trade queens because your bishop's hanging at the end. And then he says this is just a draw because black can't do anything. I'm not sure if I agree with that, but I'll still take black. But I like the queen on e4, so I must admit. And Fischer played g3, which is really weakening. And after queen c6 check, which I'm sure he saw, he probably thought after rook e4, he could trade off the b pawn. Then the game should be a draw, because this is the wrong colored rook pawn for black. So probably Fischer thought this position was a draw. And this is very interesting because after the queen trade, if I was black, especially if I was playing a blitz game, I would definitely play bishop e7, defending my pawn on b4. And that move actually isn't good. And he played the correct rook to b6, because now you can't get rid of that pawn. That pawn, you're going to save your b pawn, and if black keeps the b pawn the rest of the game, black's going to win with his extra piece, and if white can trade off that pawn, it's probably a draw. But now, I guess Fischer underestimated rook b6. And they just played normal chess now, but black's up a piece. So, yeah. And the end had sort of a funny ending because Tal liked to play tactically. So there was a funny tactic at the end. But this is a relatively simple win, I think. He's trying to trade the pawn. Obviously, Tal doesn't want to. And he's trying to win that pawn, but he can't. It's unfortunate. And the last move of the game I thought was pretty funny. He played b2, which hangs his rook, but then I promote with discovered check. So that's sort of a fun way to win, I guess. And here Fischer resigned. And again, this was an amazing game where both sides had a lot of chances, but again, Fischer was 16. So when Fischer was a teenager, Tal was better, and Tal had a good score against Fischer, irrespective of who was winning on the board. And then things obviously turned around later. This is actually a very common theme in the history of chess, because normally world champions aren't exactly the same age. So a lot of times people who are world champions historically, they played each other either when one was the world champion and one was much younger, or neither one was world champion yet, and sometimes the results don't match what you would expect because they're not world champions yet, they're younger. So Fischer, unlike a lot of players at that time, had many, many, many games published in magazines and books when he was a teenager, which is common today, but not then. And so you're going to see a lot of his losses. I mean, Fischer has games published when he was rated 2,000, 2,100, 2,200. So, you know, if you can find a game Karpov played when he was 2,000, good luck to you. I've never found one. Then you'll see that, you know, they lose more than you would expect because they're not who they are yet. They're up and coming. Although this was a candidates tournament, which I guess if you're 16 now, that's normal. But in 1959, that's ridiculous. Firouzja would just think it's normal, I guess. All right. The next game is also crazy. And Fischer's white again. He wasn't white every game, but okay. And they played another Sicilian. And I remember specifically this game, Fischer was very negative towards Tal's opening play. In this position in particular, I think he believes Tal made the losing move, which is hard to believe. The point of g3 seems to be to play bishop to g2, but there's actually another point, is that white wants to play bishop to f4 and knight to b5 and come in those dark squares. So Fischer was of the opinion that black should play a6 here, typical Sicilian move, and stop this knight from coming to b5. But Tal didn't do that, and knight f6, if I remember my 60 memorable games, Fischer thought that was really terrible. And now he starts the attack because he can play bishop f4. And he did. I mean, e5 looks terrible. You're giving away the d5 square. d6 just hangs the d pawn. I think it loses the queen too. So you have to play knight e5. And I guess Tal thought this was okay. And Fischer did not agree. And I really like the move that Fischer played here. I think it's one I never would have thought of. It's bishop to e2. He didn't play g3 to fianchetto. He played it to play bishop f4. And now the bishop on e2 is controlling a lot of squares. And he's ready to castle, and black's position looks sort of strange. And Tal played bishop c5. The point of bishop e2 is white wants to play queen d4 next move, which is very annoying. However, if the bishop's on f1, knight f3 check would fork the king and queen. So bishop e2 threatens queen d4, attacking the knight on e5. Then white could castle queenside and put pressure on the d file. And white's making a threat every move. So Tal played bishop c5, which stops queen d4, and Fischer took, which is a move. If I had the black pieces, I probably wouldn't have considered, but it's an excellent move because it's not based on positional understanding. It's just based on calculation. And once you calculate the next two moves, you realize black is lost. But it's a very surprising move because the knight is pinned to the queen and you're letting black get out. But that's because white can play f4 and e5 with tempo and white's just winning. The knight has nowhere to go. So white is completely crushing black. If black plays knight to g8, which I'm not a fan of, white plays knight to e4, attacking the bishop, and we get to come into d6 square. And, if I was streaming, I would say connect 4 and all kinds of stuff. Okay, so this is already losing for black. So Tal played a6. He doesn't want his knight, so moving on knight e4. And Fischer gets this pawn on g7 and plays knight e4, attacking the bishop and attacking knight f6 check. So bishop e7 is forced. Queen d4 defends the pawn on g7. Rook a4 attacking everything. Check, takes. Queen c7, threatening the c2 pawn. Fischer castles, which gives away the a2 pawn, which doesn't matter. Always play king b1. And the game is basically over. The pawn on g7 is too good. The bishop on c8 is ridiculous. Bishop takes b5. Bishop d3, threatening bishop takes h7. And other than Tal making a mistake in the opening and Fischer totally punishing him, this is the next interesting part of the game. And very often, when I was a chess coach and I was giving private lessons, these are some bad memories for me. I have to go to therapy after this. My students and their opponents would play book openings that all grandmasters play, like Sicilians. And then both players would totally botch up the move order, allowing the opponent to punish them, and nobody ever got punished. So neither player never knew. So it didn't matter if my student was the one blundering or my student's opponent was. Nobody's getting punished for their blunders. And they would just transpose into a regular position. And I would be like, all right. But the next time when your opponent plays this way, which nobody does, the reason nobody does it is like this wins. And you don't see that at the top level because they play the move order correctly. But in the 1950s and 60s, they were still working out the move order. And so nowadays people play a6 earlier because of games like this. Now, instead of resigning because bishop takes h7 wins, Tal played e5. And that attacks the queen by discovery. And if white plays the obvious queen takes pawn, we trade queens, we win the g7 pawn, and white's still better, but not completely winning. Although maybe winning, but a little winning. And this is where Fischer played a surprising move, which reminds me a lot of the Botvinnik semi-Slav variation, which is totally insane. He takes with a pawn and sacrifices his queen because, as you can see, this pawn duo is pretty good and bishop h7 is winning and you can't stop it. And this bishop is ridiculous and rook here check is good and bishop h7 is good and so forth, mainly and so forth. If you attack the f6 pawn with the queen, white just plays rook f1. So Tal played queen c5, which is the best move. And after bishop takes h7, he played queen g5. And the idea is he's not only attacking the f6 pawn, if white defends the f6 pawn, let's say rook f1, then he can play rook takes g7, queen takes g7, and get rid of those pawns. It'll be a queen versus two rooks. And that should also be winning for white. And that's what happened. We got the queen versus two rooks, but white has two extra pawns. Black's bishop is ridiculous. White's king is safe. So this is a very easy win. Now, when I was rated 900 and 1100 and 1500, those are the rings I remember when I was a kid, I had the book, My 60 Memorable Games, and I remember Fischer saying, this is the easiest win in the history of chess. I knew I would win this. I never beat Tal before, so finally I got him, and I made sure it was very simple. And when I was 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years old, I was like, I don't know, it's 2 rooks for a queen. I don't know. Now that I'm a grandmaster, I'm going to take white here. Man, am I going to take white. But when I was a little kid, I was like, I don't know, queen for 2 rooks. Doesn't look easy to me. It looks easy now, but not when I was 9 years old. Fischer played bishop to e6 because the pawn's pinned, and Tal made a very bad move here, queen h6. Very poor move. Sort of a giving up move, letting Fischer play very simple tactic. He's winning anyway, but this hastens his defeat. Now he loses everything. So that wasn't good defense there. Yeah, you can't lose everything. And there's no perpetual check anywhere. So Fischer toyed with him a little bit. And Rig d1 stops all the checks. So there's no checks. So that's not good. Yeah, and after g4, if you take on g4, I just assumed rook e1 check and rook takes b5, but the guy says rook h1 wins. That's actually pretty cute. I want to show you guys that. Threatening rook h8 mate, and you can't stop it, because if you stop it, you didn't stop it. The truth hurts. Yeah, that's pretty nice, actually. That's better than the way I would have won, which is 90 moves. So he played queen here instead of resigning. Not sure why he's not resigning. Seems like a good time to resign. Still not resigning. Wow. Man. What's happening? Well, why isn't he resigning? Okay. All right, and then he resigned here. I don't know why he played on so long. It's a bit silly. And Fischer claimed in the My 60 Memorable Game books that he was beating Tal frequently, but would never beat him. So this was, he beat him finally. So 1961, Fischer turned 18. I'm not sure if this was before or after his birthday. Probably after, because his birthday was in March. So that's the most likely. But Fischer played Tal before this a few times. And, Tal was world champion strength and Fischer wasn't. So, but their games were like this quite often. And this is one of my pet peeves today. People complain that when you have slow chess at the top level today, that the players are so good. Okay, anyway, that all the games are draws because the players are too good. And I don't believe that at all. I believe the games are all draws because the players are very afraid of losing. And obviously, if you're number 5 in the world and you start losing, and now you're number 15 in the world, I have to sneeze a second. Excuse me. You don't get so many invitations because they'll invite people who are higher rated than you. So a lot of the players who are top 10 in the world, they like to keep their world ranking, so they draw a lot. Other people like Karpov, Kasparov, Fischer, and I could go on, Tal, they want to win all their games and become world champion. And obviously if you draw your games and you're rated like number 6 in the world, that's not a good recipe for becoming world champion. And some people just figure they won't be world champion, but they want to be top 10 in the world as long as possible. So a lot of the games, people are playing 20, 25 moves of theory, getting an equal position, and then drawing. And when they play rapid and blitz, especially on the internet, those games aren't FIDE rated. Now they play more interesting chess. There's more decisive games, and people want to watch that now. And their reasoning is slow chess is a draw because the players have a lot of time and they play perfectly. And it's not true. It's just that the players are chicken. And when players aren't chicken, like these guys, these are the games that you see. When they do a lot of calculation and it's back and forth. And sometimes the games are draws, and they're really interesting. And sometimes the games are not. And if you invite the right super GMs to the right tournaments, even in slow chess, you're not going to have as many draws. But if you invite the wrong super GMs, you can have a lot of draws. So it's weird, even in some of the rapid events, for example, Radjabov, he drew like, I don't know, 17 of his first 18 games in the rapid tournament. Like, what? How do you draw your games in rapid? Okay, I guess if you want to, you do. Wesley So took him out back. So Fischer and Tal played this kind of really interesting, hard to play chess. And they did something which is a very interesting way of playing, which is you don't necessarily make the best move, you try to, but what you do is you make it very difficult for your opponent to make the best move. And if your opponent has lots and lots and lots of decisions to make, some of them are going to be wrong. And that's why they won so many games. Fischer and Tal, known for winning a lot of games, okay, and not a ton of draws. Okay, and last but not least was a famous blitz tournament, and this was shocking to me, but not too shocking. And I'd never seen either blitz game, but I did look at every game they've ever played together that I could find, and these were the 3 games that I picked. The other blitz game was just, it was a double round robin, so one with white, one with black. The other blitz game was just Fischer outclassing Tal. I mean, just rolled him. I mean, one a pawn here, one a pawn there, give a dog a bone. Okay, this game was a really back and forth crazy game, and finally Tal got a winning rook ending, but I'm guessing both players had no time on their clock. And this is 1970, so there's no increment and there's no delay because that didn't exist. And there's no digital clock. So your flag goes up. If you know what an analog clock is, some of you don't, then it falls and you don't know when it's going to fall. And by not knowing when it's going to fall, this is why I beat Elvest and Julian Hodgson, because they were beating me and their flags fell and they were like, what? So the good player is always lucky. Or in my case, the worst player was lucky because those guys are a lot better than me. I've won some games with analog clocks before you guys were born because people's flag fall and they're like, what? It's not digital. There's no delay. There's no increment. This is a blitz game with an analog clock. So they're probably moving as fast as humanly possible, which means they're not going to play better than perfect. And again, as a fan, this is what people want to see. And I would rather see the best moves, but occasionally I want to see the top players blunder too because it's funny. Okay, so Tal played rook takes b7, and this is just winning for white. White has a winning ending. One reason is white's up a pawn, but and black has 3 isolated pawns. But more importantly, white's king can move up the board and black's cannot. So white has all kinds of advantages. All right, now Fischer, being Fischer, he knew how to get counterplay. Man, did he get counterplay. A lot of people play very passively in rook endings. Those people usually aren't grandmasters. So rook a2, the most aggressive. King f3, always move your king up in the end game. Okay, rook takes. The engine just wants to move the king up, but this is also winning. c4, and now white has a decision to make. He can take on c4, which gives him less winning chances because there's fewer pawns on the board, or he can play d4, which is almost certainly winning, d4, d5, d6, but then black gets a passed pawn. And he probably had like 20 seconds on his clock. So he's tall, he's not Geary, so he played d4. And I'm making fun of Geary, but I'm also serious. I think Geary would take on c4 because the top players now want to minimize their chances of losing. Never want to lose. All right, I guess. So d4 maximizes white's winning chances, and obviously black has chances now. There's 5 passed pawns on the board. So c3, d5, rook d2 attacking the pawn, king e4, c2, rook c7. Okay, and as I like to say, I got 2 passed pawns, 1 for each of you. And after king d8, he played a5, and he's going to play a4, a3, a2, a1. And here, Tal made a mistake, but he's still winning. He played h4. h4 is a tale told by an idiot full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. h4 makes no sense. So white's winning very easily, which he did next move, but h4 just loses a tempo. That pawn doesn't matter. White should just play king e5, king to d6, and then he wins. But he played h4, which loses a tempo, so Fischer played a4. You can't take the a4 pawn because black queens. Now Tal found the right way to win, still winning, a3. And now, even though this was played in 1970, Zoidberg showed up, which doesn't make a lot of sense, and he said, stop the game, it's too exciting. And here Tal blundered. Now there was a blunderfest because engines didn't exist and both players moved instantly. So that makes it tougher. King d6 is winning. The engine says something like plus 1 billion. So king d6 wins. Tal played d6, which does not win. But it's very complicated why it doesn't win. And obviously, when players have seconds here, there's just no way they're going to play correct. There's no way. You're just guessing. You know. Obviously, you can see h4 doesn't make any sense. Like, what did that have to do with what's going on? White just lost the tempo. If white's pawn was on h2, he could have done this and had another move. So, okay, and Fischer played rook e2 check, which is that a mistake? Let's see. Yeah, rook e2 check is a mistake. He should have played a2 because he wants to queen with check. And now Tal made a mistake. The engine says king d5 wins, but he played king f5, which does not win. And here Fischer blundered, and then Tal blundered. And it's funny because I wasn't playing the game. If I was playing the game, it would be less funny. In this position, a2 draws, but he played rook here check. And this is pretty funny. Here Tal made a really bad move. He played king g4, but I was wondering what's wrong with king g6. I was just wondering on my own. And then after a2, d7, rook f6 check wins. If the king moves, I take the pawn on e6, and the d7 pawn's not defended. If you take my rook, I queen on a1 with check. And then I queen my c pawn. Man, harsh. Okay, although I might have to check you some first, I don't know. But that was engine analysis. And Tal played king g4, which is a very bad move. And Fischer played a2. The more moves that I make, and the more we analyze this, the more you realize how h4 just makes no sense. That white just lost the tempo with h4. He didn't play h5, h6, h7, h8. They just kept playing the rest of the game with white playing this stupid h4 move, which lost the tempo. And this position is a draw, and Tal blundered. Obviously, they both had no time on their clock, and they're just moving instantly. So I don't really blame them. The drawing line, which confused me, according to the engine, was here, takes, queen, king takes rook. And the engine says this is a draw. And I was like, all right. Black does have 2 pawns on the 7th, so if white ever plays queen takes rook, I'm not saying white can play queen takes rook, but if he can, black just makes a queen. So the engine says this is all zeros, which confused me. Okay, so that was correct, but Tal played d7. And if it's white's move, white plays rook c8 check, queens with check, and wins. So Tal's still playing for the win, obviously. Makes sense? Now, one of the reasons I was wondering why Tal didn't play king g6, you will now see. Fischer played king e7, and then he played rook to d2. If white's king was on g6 here, then he would have more options to try to do something good. The king on g4 does nothing. That's unfortunate. Then rook check, king goes here, e7. Man. If the king was on g6 in this position, rook e8 check would win. King d6, queen would check. That's why black has that rook f6 check move, which was important. Okay, and now he played e7. And the engine just queens, and after white queens, it announces mate, because the queen and rook attacked the white king. But Fischer played the human move, rook takes d7. So that's very frustrating. That's one of the most frustrating things in chess. When you're completely winning, you mess it up. Now it's a draw, but you don't want to draw because you're completely winning. And maybe you didn't mess it up, you don't know, and then you lose. And it's possible if Tal wasn't completely winning before, he would have played e7 check and drew, but he just had to find a win. And unfortunately, he found the win for Fischer. And these kind of finishes happen all the time at every level when you're playing blitz chess. When both players have 5, 10, 20, 30 seconds left, it's just random. Like somebody's going to win, but it's not necessarily who has the better position. And amazingly, Tal lost all of his pawns that mattered, and Fischer still has 2 pawns in the 7th rank. And it doesn't matter where this rook moves, I can play king takes e7 and win. And if the rook doesn't move, rook takes e7 wins, or queening. So Tal resigned here. But that was an amazing turnaround. When I saw the result of that game, I said, wait a minute, that can't be the result. And then I played over the game, and I'm like, oh, Tal just made lots of errors because he had no time on his clock. And spectators like to see that because they like to see world champions blunder every move. But it's not because they're not great players, it's because they're moving in 1 second. And they don't know when their flag's going to fall because they're playing with the analog clock with no delay and no increment. So it makes the game silly at the end, which some people like and some people don't. They're like, these guys are 2,800. I want to see perfect chess and I want to see them analyzed correctly. And other people want to see them blunder and laugh at them. So this is one of those instances where Fischer was dead lost, and if Tal had time in the last 15 moves, he would have won the game, but he didn't, and Fischer played really good defense to get this counterplay. Fischer had no counterplay, and now look at Fischer's passed pawns. And this is the difference between like a super GM and a weaker player, is when they're losing, they find all the play. And they might still be losing, but they make it very difficult. And in fact, this was a strength that both players had, Tal and Fischer. So just because you have a winning position doesn't mean you're going to win. And just because the players are similar strength doesn't mean it's going to be a draw if the players don't want to draw. If the players want to fight, they can fight. And there can be lots of decisive games. Unfortunately, nowadays, that's not always the case. It's not always the case that people want to fight. Sometimes they don't want to fight. This is unfortunate. Anyway, that's what makes PogChamps interesting, and that's what makes Tal and Fischer interesting. Fischer, as you know, has the record for most wins in a row against grandmasters, something like 20. And until recently, Tal had the record for most consecutive games without losing that were FIDE rated. You could argue that he still has the record that Tiviakov broke, but Carlsen broke the record also. Tiviakov is like a strong GM. He's like better than me, but worse than a super GM. And he had a lot of games in a row without losing too. But again, if the games are all draws, how is that? But okay, these are two of the greatest players who ever lived. And even the games they played that were draws were very interesting. And this was just a random blitz game they played. And they both had all their pawns on the 7th rank. So that was one of the most exciting games, except for Tal, who lost. It's unfortunate. I recommend highly looking at games of Tal and Fischer and trying to understand them, because they calculated really far ahead. They had really interesting Sicilians, other openings too, but their Sicilian games, they played white and black in the Sicilian, and they didn't play like what they do now, like boring Petrovs and boring Ruy Lopez's, where there's 25 moves of theory and the position is equal and everybody's drawing and everybody's happy. That's not what these guys did. They played for a win with both colors, and because of that, all of their games were like this. And even their blitz game would go back and forth because you have no time on your clock. Anyway, that's Fischer and Tal, and those are two of my favorite players, obviously, for a lot of the reasons that I mentioned. And because of the way chess has become over the last 100 years, we can look at everybody's games, which is great. You have the availability with databases and the internet to find your favorite players and look at their games no matter how old they are, and you can still appreciate it. Well, this is Grandmaster Ben Finegold for the Chess Club and Scholastic Center of Atlanta. Please like and subscribe if you're watching on YouTube, and click for the next video. And let's give a round of applause, even if you're at home right now watching on YouTube, for our sponsor, Patrick Davenport, who liked Fischer and Tal. Doesn't like him as much as I do, but maybe he does. I'll see you guys next time. Bye, everyone.